west of the Peruvian Andes is a mountain range known as the Cordillera Huayhuash. Its giant peaks form part of the continental divide, with half of its waters flowing through the Amazon to the Atlantic and the other half flowing to the Pacific. The mountains themselves reach altitudes of over 21,000 feet and form part of the second highest mountain range in Peru. In the areas that surround the mountain range, around 20,000 people live, either in small villages that cling to the ridges going up to the mountains, or lie deep, nestled within the valleys. These villages have no more than about 1,000 people each, and were formed between 300 and 500 years ago. Once in the villages, travel is by horses, donkeys, or simply by foot. The land directly beneath the peaks is owned in a communal manner. The communities practice three principal economic activities, which are all based on annual cycles of dry and wet. During the wet season, from the months of December to March, people live in simple structures made from local materials in order to take care of the animals while they're at high altitudes. On the steep slopes and up to altitudes of 11,500 or 12,000 feet, potatoes are grown for subsistence consumption. Over 3,000 kinds of potatoes are known to exist in the Andes of Peru. Sheep are also kept for their valuable wool. The products from their wool either enter local markets for ponchos, blankets, and sweaters to keep people warm, or they may end up going to a market as far away as Lima, or even for a sweater for a tourist. But the principal economic activity in this region is cheese making. Kilos and kilos of cheese are made every week, some of which will end up on the table for lunch. But most of it goes to markets as distant as Lima, starting the journey on horseback. All of these economic activities rely on the water that flows from the glaciers. In this region, there's a saying that water is life. The precipitation that accumulates in the glaciers from the months of December to March and then flows off through the valleys in the dry season is the key to all economic activity in this region. But in the last 2 decades, things have started to see change. Tourism has become an important alternative economic activity, and indeed the Cordillera Huayhuash has become one of the top 10 trekking destinations in the world. Mining, while it's existed for centuries and even in pre-Inca times, has taken a turn in the last 2 decades of scale. While these medium-scale mines have brought important jobs and economic activity, the growth in interest is startling. As this map shows in red, the purchased mining rights in the area have grown dramatically in the last 20 years. But this is not a phenomenon that's just taking place in the Huayhuash. Indeed, all of Peru has experienced the same growth in interest in mining, largely due to a constitutional shift in 1993. This has brought concern.
Yo creo que este río Huayhuash, acá este es el río Pachapata, acá el río acá que viene de acá del otro lado, también el río Carnicero, ya va a ser contaminado.
El problema es que no me gusta la minería porque hay muchas contaminaciones, como se está escuchando en muchas minas, por ejemplo en Raura. Hay mucha contaminación a la sangre para los niños.
Estoy en contra de la minería. Claro, es bueno económicamente, ¿no? Pero es casi como que está sembrando un mal vivir hacia el ser humano que va a impactar con el tiempo.
Mining is not the only economic activity bringing environmental impacts to the region. With over 3,000 tourists visiting a year, nearly 10,000 pack animals walk the circuit each season. They consume valuable resources that were once communally managed and are now an open access resource available to all tourist agencies. Overgrazing and desertification is evident in the campsites. Additionally, careless guides and tourists are leaving garbage along the circuit where they spend the night.
Bueno, a lo que estamos viendo, yo creo que está contaminando. O sea que traen a veces las basuras, los desechos y lo dejan por el camino. Eso sería uno, y otro es pues que vienen con los animales, ¿no? De los caballares, asnales, a gran cantidad como estamos observando en estos momentos.
Porque esos animalitos prácticamente nos perjudican, en tanto es su necesidad que ellos hacen, es algo contaminoso, y aparte los pastos que ellos consumen, no consumen como los carneros, ¿no? Como las vacas, sino atraen desde la raíz,
Aware of these problems, local leaders came to a consensus in 2003 to do something. They decided to make private conservation areas.
En base a la titulación que tenemos, hemos gestionado para hacer un área de conservación. Bueno, y hemos tenido bastante apoyo de una organización del SPA, Sociedad Peruana de Derecho Ambiental, que también nos han apoyado para ciertas gestiones. Y de otra parte, también últimamente el señor Tim nos ha apoyado en todo lo que es mapas.
Instead of working with the National Conservation Area proposed in 2001, the communities formed 4 private conservation areas and finished in 2008. Their principal concern was conserving the pasture as the basis of their livelihood and the biodiversity that is found within these pastures. 2 principal conservation activities were prioritized. The first was to do a water quality analysis across the entire range, and the second was to do a pasture assessment based on productivity. Transects were walked with local leaders at both the campsites and on communally held lands.
Esta es la misma familia que el calva calva.
También, ¿no?
Rara, no hay mucho.
Poco hay.
Si encontramos otra, trata de sacarlo más profundo. ¿El nombre de esto? Jararegua es otro. Yo conozco Jararegua.
At each site, 100-meter transects were walked, where at every step it was recorded what species was found.
Este es un agrostis.
Over the span of 2 years, 22 sites were evaluated, over 10,400 observations made, 150 species identified within 74 genera and 20 plant families. The water monitoring effort was also undertaken in collaboration with local leaders. Analysis for both biological contamination and heavy metals would be performed.
Y estos medidas cambian durante el año. Con la lluvia, la pH baja.
Simple field instruments were used to measure pH, temperature, and salinity, and the results were duly recorded. For the biological contamination, strict protocols were observed.
Hay una inversión al inicio, ¿no? Comprar todas estas cositas. Si compra en caja, vale algo de 50 centavos cada uno. Todo listo, vamos a medir 200.
Strict protocols were also observed for the heavy metal samples.
Y esta fija que los metales queden en la agua, porque el código en la hoja es el código en la botella. Y hemos sacado la muestra para metales pesados.
Over the course of 2 years, over 90 samples were taken at 40 different stations. The results showed contamination from mining activity, from tourism, and from natural sources. The results were presented back to the communities through workshops. Mining rights were discussed, the results were discussed, and measures to mitigate the impacts were considered.
Hemos iniciado algo, pero realmente la fin es tener un monitoreo que sigue por años, ¿no?
The workshops also focused on map literacy.
¿Cómo se llama esta laguna? Esta laguna será allá.
Yanacocha.
Eso, este es Yanacocha, ¿no? Este es lo otro que sale por aquí.
Chico Yanacocha.
Uchas, ¿no? Que armamos un mapa de todo lo Huayhuash con todos los nombres correctos. Yo he entregado estos a todas las comunidades ya.
The results from the pasture study were also presented back to the communities through workshops.
Porque tener más vacas es un signo de distinción, ¿no? El que tiene más vacas acá es más poderoso, es más respetado. ¿Sí o no? Sí. ¿Qué es mejor? Si yo tengo 10 vacas que me producen 2 litros, o tengo 5 vacas que me producen 8 litros cada una, que es posible en esta zona. la Maglosti sureta, ¿no? Que lo descubrió él, porque es así, ¿no? La planta lleva el nombre, generalmente, el nombre del que lo descubrió.
Pues para mí es un honor de estar con cada uno de ustedes, pues una gratitud.
Quedo primeramente profundamente agradecido y aún más por el trabajo que realmente ha sido importante.
Much work remains to be done to protect this important range, and the Akus, or the spirits of the mountains, are waiting.